1 or 2, I think. Alhamdulillah. I think 2 minutes are up. Inshallah, I think we can get started. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي اللهم زدنا علما اللهم فقهنا في الدين ربي يسر ولا تعسر ربي من خير نستعين يا فتاح. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of CISNA, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to welcome everybody today at Dr. Ayda's session. Alhamdulillah, this session is sponsored by CISNA, the Council of Islamic Schools in North America. CISNA takes pride in being the lead in Islamic schools accreditation, governance training, and advocacy for Islamic schools. Alhamdulillah. And with that, inshallah, I will inshallah introduce our renowned speaker for the session today, Dr. Ayda Succarie. I hope I've pronounced your last name correctly, Dr. Ayda.
Succarie, yes.
Succarie, alhamdulillah. Again, it's my absolute honor to introduce Dr. Ayda to the audience. Dr. Ayda holds a Doctor of Philosophy, PhD, MBE, and graduate certificate in research studies from Western Sydney University. Her research focuses on the intricate connection between professional identity and governance in Australian Islamic schools, highlighting governance frameworks, methodologies in guided research, and board member well-being. Dr. Succarie has extensive experience in the curriculum development, teaching, and learning. With that, inshallah, I give the floor to Dr. Ayda. Please take us away. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, Farah. It's very nice to virtually meet everyone. And for those who were at the retreat, it's nice to see you online again, inshallah, for this what hopes to be a very beneficial session, inshallah. I'd like to firstly give you a bit of a introduction into today's session, inshallah. Today's session is going to be a continuation of the discussion around self-evaluation for board members and succession planning. And to do that, I'm going to engage in a discussion about the differences between corporate governance and school governance, or in particular Islamic school governance, and then bring you back to the framework, professional identity framework that I introduced to the group at the retreat in Dallas. So what I'd like to do is I think the session will run as more of a lecture in the beginning, and then there are some discussions. I'd like to open the platform to everyone to engage in discussions, which I like to call final reflections, and then we can have a Q&A session, inshallah. So I hope the group is okay with that, inshallah. I'd like to share my screen and get started, inshallah. So the way that the lecture will run will be it will be run with a bit of theory about governance. The session, I've called it the Governance Challenge because particularly in terms of Islamic school governance, one of the most pertinent issues and ongoing issues that we find in Islamic schooling on a global scale, and this is not just confined to Australian Islamic schools, but more broadly on a global scale, is schools often deal with governance challenges, and those challenges are relevant to how directors engage in governance practice and decision making. So I want to start the session by talking about governance and boards of directors. And to do that, I'd like to give you an understanding of what corporate governance is about. And throughout the lecture, what I'd like all participants to do is reflect on the current governance structures that you're adopting on your boards. And so if I'm talking about corporate governance, which is this first section, I want you to contemplate whether your board aligns with this type of theoretical perspective of governance. And then when I talk about other theories of governance, why is it doing that? When I talk about other theories of governance, I want you to, in defining those theories, consider and maybe make notes on whether your board is adopting that particular theory. All right, so before I get started, can I just confirm the time frame? Am I allowed free time? Rabia?
Yes, inshallah. I mean, just whatever you see fit. Inshallah, I think we can benefit. Yeah.
I always like to make sure that I know how much time I have.
Yeah, I can tell you when there's like, 30 minutes have passed so that you have like a heads up or whenever you want me to.
Inshallah, jazakallah khair.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started in talking about corporate governance. And when we talk about corporate governance, corporate governance essentially is a Western model that was developed to maintain the oversight of different types of structures, and it was mainly developed to monitor on behalf of shareholders who are the owners of public companies in particular, to ensure that the owners and shareholders of the company are receiving the maximum output of wealth. Okay, so corporate governance is about the oversight of wealth creation and maximizing wealth. Now, a standard corporate governance model is what we call a top-down approach, where shareholders are the ultimate owners, they're the members, they're the investors of a corporation. And essentially the lay word for a corporation could be a business or an entity, an organization. Shareholders will then appoint a board of directors, and the role of those directors is a role of oversight, where they ensure that the financial responsibilities are maintained. They also ensure that the CEO or the management chief executive officer who they appoint is maintaining the daily operations based on the policies that the board of directors develop for the organization. And then obviously the trickle-down effect is that management is responsible for the oversight of employees. Now, amongst that equation of a top-down approach to governance, we have stakeholders within the organization. Okay, and particularly stakeholders include suppliers, customers, for organizations that are selling goods or services. And those stakeholders have an interest in the activities of shareholders, boards of directors, management, and employees. So that's a top-down model of governance, a very traditional model that you often see within the corporate sector. There are different definitions of corporate governance. The traditional definition is basically corporate governance is a system that protects investors' interests. So as I said in the previous slide, it's about wealth maximization to ensure that investors are getting maximum returns on their investment. The organizational economic cooperation and development has added different elements to that traditional corporate governance model. And I just want to point that the traditional corporate governance model is a very capitalist model. It's based on neoliberalism, and there is a sociological discussion that occurs around the issues of defining corporate governance, but we won't go into that. So the OECD have added broader elements to the definition of corporate governance so that we can, it's doing it again, so that we can apply a more of a protection of stakeholders, relationships between the organization, directors, and shareholders. So those additional elements of the definition includes the distribution of rights and responsibilities across the organization and also across the stakeholder community. And to define a stakeholder community, we would do a stakeholder map, but mainly from a corporate perspective, stakeholders include different actors within the organization that influence directly or have an indirect influence towards the organization. Corporate governance is also, according to the OECD, a set of relationships between the company's management, between the board, and the shareholders. And there is a very important application of procedures and rules, policies for making decisions in organizations that boards and directors on boards must adhere to. Okay. Essentially, corporate governance from and the OECD may call this a way of social responsibility or being socially responsible boards. But mainly the idea of corporate governance from a socially responsible perspective is that the structure of governance is ensured to meet the organizational objective. And they do that through the process of what we call monitoring and control. So I just want you to think about, in terms of your board, what levels of monitoring and control are you applying as directors? And remembering that you may also be referred to as board members, but from a business perspective or an economical perspective, as a business academic, we refer to board members as directors. Essentially, that's what they're appointed as. Now, I want to focus now on the role of directors. And that is an extension of the definition that I've just spoken about in the previous slide. So focusing on the ultimate decision-making, the idea that directors are the ultimate decision-making body of an organization. So what does that involve? And so your role as a director would be one of oversight, as I've mentioned, and your oversight is the oversight of management and risk. Okay, so essentially that's probably an understanding of what most of you have, or all of you have, in terms of your role as a director. And without discerning that there are other responsibilities, but the basic understanding of the role of directors on boards is that the ultimate decision-making is to ensure the oversight of management and risk. From a corporate governance perspective, that includes that you are responsible for major investment decisions. Okay, so financial, operational policies, strategic decisions of the company. From a corporate governance perspective, the major investment decisions and strategic directions are essential for wealth maximization. Okay, and then the supervision of the corporate executive, chief executive officer, financial officer, These are all important elements of the governance equation. The other roles of directors is to monitor performance. And you may all be familiar with this, particularly with Islamic schools in North America. The issue of financial performance is extremely important because you are highly dependent on donors, and you engage in a lot of fundraising activities to bring in funds in addition to other elements such as tuition fees that parents will often pay for their children to attend the schools. So monitoring financial performance of the organization is essential in your school, within your schooling context. And so there's an element of relationship in terms of corporate governance. Okay. There are also organizational, and because of this funding model that you have in North America, there's also a pressure for directors on boards to engage in monitoring very heavily the organizational performance of the school. Okay, so there is a lot of research around the discussions of boards in Islamic schools more broadly, but particularly in North America, of this idea of micromanagement. And often micromanagement occurs because there is a lot of pressure on financial performance. And this is based on extensive research in Islamic schools on a global scale. Okay. And then there's the social element, because a lot of the donors and fundraising that occurs may come from local communities. And so the role of directors in Islamic schools is to monitor the performance from a social perspective, to ensure that there is a constant flow of funds that come into the school, to ensure growth, to ensure resources, and definitely that helps with payment of teachers' wages, because teachers primarily are the backbone of the school, and other key players and actors that are employed by the school or organization. So I'm taking you through this process of understanding that there are similarities, and suggesting that there are similarities in the governance models that you apply on your board with a typical corporate governance model. And because of that monitoring of performance, there is a really important component of accountability. And essentially, in corporate governance, we call that process of being accountable to owners or shareholders and stakeholders. From the context of Islamic schools, the owners and shareholders per se are generally the people or founders or organizations that have established a school, and also because of the donations that are made by community members. While schools may perceive them as stakeholders, there is an ownership element. And so the school community becomes also part of that shareholder ownership type context. All of that discussion around decision-making, performance, and accountability then sets the governance tone. So it creates a culture throughout the organization. And that culture is a typical culture of compliance, accountability, and transparency. And this is the general governance rule when we talk about corporate boards. There is definitely different types of boards. Okay, so, and that is very dependent on the governance model that is adopted by the organization. And so depending on the type of governance model that you are using on your board, that is definitely defined by that definitely defines the type of board that you have within your schools. So How then, and what models are we referring to here? From a for-profit perspective, for companies that engage in corporations that engage in profit making, whether they are a private entity or a public company that is driven by profit. Traditionally, corporate governance has researched and used, scholars have researched and used and developed what we call the agency model, which is the overarching corporate perspective. And the agency model is mainly the process of where shareholders will select directors or appoint directors in order to separate ownership and control. And they do that so that directors can ensure that they are maximizing the most profit for those shareholders, because the shareholders don't necessarily have the skills or expertise to ensure profit maximization. And so they will strategically select directors who can maximize profit. And that's something that you may be strategically using in your school, where you are strategically selecting directors who can maximize fundraising, for example. While it is not, the idea is not to generate profit, although in North America there is an element of profit for schools. The idea is that you are strategically selecting directors who are going to maximize income within the school. The other for-profit models that are being used is also a stewardship model, which is an extension of agency theory. So there is that separation of ownership of control, but then directors are also charged with the responsibility of ensuring that the needs of future and current stakeholders are met. And so we ensure that, and there's a servant-based element in stewardship theory. Directors become involved in decision-making that will benefit stakeholders. So the idea is that the interaction with stakeholders, from a school perspective, stakeholders include students, parents, the community, the broader Muslim community, for example, colleagues, staff, anyone that has a vested interest or an unvested interest within that school. Okay. And so the stewards of the organization become the directors, and their role as stewards is to make sure that everyone basically is okay. All right. And their needs are being met. Stakeholder theory is a democratic model of governance. Again, these are all extensions of agency theory. So the rules of agency still apply, but the engagement of decision-making and practice is extended with additional elements. Stakeholder theory is what we call a democratic model of governance, where boards of directors will invite stakeholders or that stakeholder community to engage in decision-making. And so it is very similar to a shura model of governance. From an Islamic perspective, if we're going into Islamic governance, stakeholder is very similar to a shura council, for example. And you may have a shura council or a shura committee that engages in democratic decision-making and provides advice and makes recommendations to the board of directors. The final theory of governance that is in extension that for-profit companies use is resource dependency model. And resource dependency is a model where directors are selected strategically based on their skills and expertise, and also their networks within the community that they come from, whether it's a economic community whether it's, you know, based on their specialization in law, based on their specialization in accounting, or even their specialization in public relations, for example. And resource dependency is the main structural element that corporations use, and particularly within research on Islamic schools, that boards of Islamic school use when they are selecting directors on the board. So what we see, a common structure for Islamic schools is, and I'll go into this when I go into the next section, but we see a traditional structure of a combination of agency and resource dependency. And so I want you to think about, okay, so what is our board doing? What structure, what models are we adopting on our board? And it could be a combination of all four, for example, different elements, different components through different committees that are an extension of your board. With regards to not-for-profit models, not-for-profit organizations or hybrid organizations like social enterprises, there are adaptations of for-profit models, and those adaptations are mainly centered around the three, what I call behavioral models of governance, which are stakeholder, stewardship, and resource dependency. And again, it can be a combination of all three in absence of agency. Okay? So they don't necessarily apply agency theory in isolation. They can only use stakeholder stewardship or resource dependency, or the structure can be developed based on a combination of all three. Okay, so that theory of governance is really to help you determine what governance structure are you using at your school. And what you might want to do after this session, and I have an activity at the end that would be beneficial for you to sit with your, you know, board of directors at a professional development session that I'm happy to facilitate if anyone is interested in that. But that activity at the end will really help you identify the board structure and the governance models that you're adopting in your school. This understanding of governance is extremely important for self-evaluation and succession planning. So understanding the different theories of governance, understanding governance from a corporate perspective will really help refine how you move forward in terms of your board. But I don't want to limit the discussion on corporate governance. I don't want to limit the discussion to corporate governance. Essentially, the idea here is that for Islamic schools, we are considering the structures that we are using now within our Islamic schools and understanding that the challenges that arise because of using those structures and then moving or shifting from a Western perspective into an Islamic perspective, so that we can align essentially with the Islamic ethos that we're adopting in these schools. Because our schools are guided by an Islamic ethos that incorporates an Islamic vision, that incorporates an Islamic mission. The idea is that under the banner of Islam, we are organizing and operating an institution that benefits Muslim children, the Muslim community, to ensure the well-being of the Muslim Ummah. The next part of the session is looking at, okay, so self-evaluation and succession planning. And this is going to be an extension of what I discussed in the retreat. And so when I think about corporate governance, I always, throughout my 10+ years of research on governance, corporate governance, and particularly governance in Islamic schools, this contemplation of broadening the governance perspective, it becomes an essential part of this discussion. What do I mean by broadening the governance perspective? In the literature, we talk about this understanding of governance practice. And so the previous slides that I spoke about is from the economic perspectives of corporate governance. Most of the economic perspective of governance talks about these different models and theories and frameworks, and it's all centered around wealth creation. But there are definitely scholars who are multidisciplined within business schools. That multidisciplinary process is in sociology and organizational studies. And what we are interested in is an understanding that governance is about practice, governance is about behavior, and essentially, in turn, that practice and that behavior is centered around directors on boards. And so depending on how directors on boards engage and interact in practice, so your practices, your decision-making, but not only your decision-making and practices, because those practices and decision-making that you engage in is influenced by your behaviors. And so in organizational studies, we focus on the idea of the roles of directors on boards, their behaviors, their attitudes, their aspirations, and particularly in my specialization, the identity of directors on boards. Okay. And so then the impetus for succession planning becomes, rather than focusing on only the governance structures and frameworks that you can adopt and implement and create for your board, which is great, and then you'll end up with this top-down model. The impetus for succession planning, when you think about governance from a behavioral perspective or an organizational perspective, the impetus for succession planning then becomes this discussion about individual and group characteristics. And so you begin to have these intimate discussions on your board about individuals and group characteristics. For example, you may be now referring to a group or a committee that exists as an extension of the board and try and identify the behavioral characteristics of each individual person. Start to identify what their professional identity is and to see whether that professional identity is compatible with the work of that committee. Okay. The impetus, again, for behavioral, when thinking from a behavioral governance perspective, allows you to look at the environmental surroundings, okay, of the board. Again, we're now focusing mainly on the board context. We're not looking at an outward perspective. We're now looking internally, all right? Before I move on, I want to focus on this element of environmental surrounding. Something that is very common, particularly when we're having discussions in the boardroom. And this comes from not only my observations as a director myself, but also observations of, years of research in looking at different dynamics on boards. Directors on boards will often engage in outward thinking. And this is a reality, I think, that we, when we acknowledge, it enables us to really contemplate and think about our role as a director on a board. Okay. The process of outward thinking, and that also engages in, okay, so how are we going to strategically allocate funds to this particular project that we want in our school? What are we going to do in terms of, the professional evaluation of the principal this year, for example? How are we going to ensure that this amount of dollars is allocated specifically to resources for teaching and learning in, mainstream subjects like English, maths, and science? And that element of outward thinking that directors engage in is great to maintain the day-to-day operations of the school, but that outward thinking really limits or creates an environmental surrounding that doesn't allow boards to reflect on the type of culture that exists within the school. Because when we think as a board member outwardly, mainly focusing on the outward elements that are relevant to the board, whether it's in infrastructure, education, administration, etc., or fundraising, that creates a culture where every stakeholder or every person that is interacting within the school, whether they are an employee, a student, or a parent, they are also thinking outwardly. And that dynamic requires a series of workshops, which is very limited in terms of today's capacity, but definitely we can have discussions to go beyond that in trying to identify. So how do we transition from the outward process of thinking and create a culture that is centered around an inward dynamic or an inward philosophy? To do that, essentially, it's important that we allow ourselves as directors on boards, or you allow yourself as directors on boards to openly discuss the governance issues within your schools. So when I say governance issues in Islamic schools, what am I referring to? And just to reiterate, this is all a process to really help with succession planning, okay, which is beyond boards that go beyond your lifetime, okay? Governance issues in Islamic schools, again, because of this outward process, are always focused on infrastructure, fundraising, education, administration. So the really mandated, typical discussions or the main elements of schooling, all right? When we think inwardly, the governance issues become a lot more intimate. And in a recent publication that I've written, that's coming out very soon, inshallah, in an edited volume that you will have access to, inshallah. I'll forward the link when it comes out. There is an idea or an assumption that well-being is sort of discussed in the shadows. And I call the discussion of well-being the hidden truths of Islamic schools. So when we allow ourselves as a board to talk inwardly, then we identify that parents have challenges and expectations that we often place on the sideline because we make decisions to say that parents' expectations are beyond the scope of discussion in the boardroom, for example. Another typical governance issue is a discussion on different components or elements of curriculum that we often shy away from, that we don't want to talk about, or again, the process of discussions that are occurring in the shadows, but not discussions that are open for interaction and decision-making within the board. And when I'm talking about curriculum, I'm talking, for example, and you may be engaging and interacting in this, but having very open discussions about sexual education, for example, within Islamic schools, but not just to say, how are we going to deal with this issue, because it is an issue, but rather to say and acknowledge that there is a global youth culture around this discussion, particularly within the Islamic community or the Muslim community. So governance issues that are really pertinent and identified because of that inward thinking and that inward process. And so all of these thoughts about broadening the governance perspective really helps us think about how do we separate the external discussion or the outward discussion and the inward discussion, but more importantly, how do we then shelve the outward discussion so that we can engage in inward discussion to create an organizational culture where there is a lot of openness and dialogue. And that it starts in the board. That starts in the boardroom. And so based on several years of research in looking at governance structures and models in Islamic schools, Australian Islamic schools, and Islamic schools in multiple jurisdictions, particularly in Anglo-American jurisdictions. So I'm focusing more on Islamic schools that exist in Western countries. Although this also applies in Muslim countries, certainly. The traditional governance model that we're applying in our Islamic schools is based on 4 elements. And those 4 elements are the 4 main elements of compliance, accountability, transparency, and leadership. And so this may resonate with all of you or most of you on your boards, that you are confident that your board is compliant. There is a high standard of accountability. You engage in transparency through your interactions with, the school community. And leadership is important and pertinent. You are engaging in a resource dependency model where you're strategically selecting directors who are going to benefit the work of the board. If we want to create a governance model that is going to allow us to create an inward organizational culture that is centered around Islamic school improvement, that is centered around identifying the governance, openly identifying the governance issues that exist within your schools, then it's important that we think about governance from an Islamic perspective. And so the Islamic perspective based on, and this has come from directors themselves and their awareness through their professional identity of their Muslim selves. Okay, so the impetus for joining a board, the role, their stewardship role on the board, which aligns with Islamic governance, and all the other elements that are pertinent to the inward model of thinking. And so boards that adopt a faith-based governance framework apply the 4 main elements, because we, from an Islamic perspective, find it very pertinent and important that we engage in these 4 main elements. This is part of our fitrah. In addition to that, our fitrah is to engage in servant-based practice. This is something that is embedded in our discussion around the vicegerency role that we play as Muslims, and the purpose of our existence, essentially, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us into this world. The next is, the idea of ethics. And we're focusing on ethics in particular because ethics is at the epicenter of our Aqidah. Okay. When we talk about equality, we're referring to equality amongst stakeholder groups. And so the expectations, for example, if I look from an inward perspective, a really important governance issue that exists within Islamic schools across the board is the equality between religious instruction teachers or Islamic school teachers and mainstream teachers. And that includes equality of remuneration, so pay. It includes equality of the rights and freedoms of Islamic scripture teachers or Islamic studies teachers, and also Arabic teachers or any other language teachers. When we compare Islamic studies teachers to mainstream teachers, and this is based on research that I'm working on now, understanding how the professional identity of teachers influences the governance of Islamic schools, okay? And so this idea of equality is, how equitable are we in terms of the way we deal with the needs of our Islamic studies teachers and our mainstream teachers? The final component or element is this idea of social justice. And this is extremely important. A lot of debates have been had around the idea of social justice. In Islam, we like to refer to justice as a standalone foundation. The idea of social justice is identifying the collective within Islamic schools. What are we doing in terms of well-being within Islamic schools? Okay. How are we ensuring that the expectations of parents, if they appear as draconian, for example, where you know, they are beyond the complexity, or parents' needs, expectations are extremely demanding, how do we then try and identify that expectation occurs or exists because of the culture that exists within the school? And so we contemplate and think about social justice from the perspective of the inward perspective, that the issues that exist within our schools are issues that are creating an injustice towards the different elements or different people that have a stake within the school that we are governing. And so the outcome is this faith-based model framework of governance that ensures a complete understanding or an inward understanding of the school, the school that we are governing as a board. How do we achieve that? How do we get to this inward process or inward thinking of governance? The main idea is through the self-evaluation framework that I've developed, which is a professional identity framework. And that professional identity framework incorporates a Muslim identity. And at the center of this discussion, and this is something that I discussed in the retreat, at the center of the professional identity framework is the director, okay? At a micro level, the director is responsible to consider inwardly their purpose for sitting on the board. This is at the micro level, the closest level to thinking and reflecting internally. And then after you identify purpose, you think about your attitudes and your actions. So that's at a micro level. And we did some activities at the retreat that looked at helping you identify your attitudes, how your purpose aligns with your attitudes and your actions. These are the components of a Muslim identity. Remembering that a Muslim identity is not based on a social contract, rather it's an individual contract between yourself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The meso level or the intermediate level is, you know, aligning your values, attributes, and beliefs with this understanding of the three elements of Muslim identity. And this is the values, attributes, and beliefs that are connected to developing your professional identity. Overarching is the macro perspective. From a lay or general understanding, we know that professional identity is a combination of skills, experience, and expertise. And so there's this element of professional training, educational background, and, you know, the paid employment or the skills that you bring into the boardroom. And this is, they use resource dependency for this. Agency theory is selected based on the macro perspective. Stewardship and stakeholder theory are also based on the macro perspective. Boards are often, shareholders and stakeholders will often select directors based on the macro perspective. Again, drawing you back to the discussion of outward thinking. This is outward, which is why it is macro. From an inward perspective, self-evaluation, when the tool is used correctly, will allow the director to identify whether they are sufficient for the role. Regardless of whether the director is an accountant, a doctor, a lawyer, or an expert in economics or finance, whatever the role, or public relations. If the director's purpose at a micro level inwardly doesn't align with the school's ethos, if the director's attitudes and actions, if your attitudes and actions are not dedicated to the work of the school and dedicated to addressing the really important governance issues that exist in the school, if your values, attributes, and beliefs are not directly inclined, and there is no, you know, wrong in saying that my values don't align with the school's values. Because definitely in particular schools, based on who select or are driven by a particular Muslim community, who follow a particular sect, or who follow particular teachings, that director might not have the same. And so what is the benefit of the director's role on the board? Does it become a position of prestige? Is it driven by elements of behavior that are driven to assume power and control? This is important for all of us as Muslims to engage in this type of reflection and thinking. And so this self-evaluation framework is important for succession planning and also daily decision-making that occurs in the boardroom. So how then do we bring everything together? You're thinking about the governance structure that exists on your board. You may not have a governance structure. How do you move forward in thinking about governance, as well as thinking about your role as a director on the board? Contemplating firstly that at a board level, how are you applying these 8 elements of governance? And you can define each element based on the interactions and the activities that occur in your school, okay? The values, the ethos, the vision, the mission, also the learning and the teaching, all the different elements of governance that are within your school. Because governance is not just compliance, accountability, transparency, and leadership. Governance is teaching Islamic studies. Governance is payment of salaries to staff within your school. Governance is also fundraising. So governance is many different things. Applying at an individual level, this framework of professional identity building will help you determine each element of governance and develop a structure that is compatible with these 8 elements. By identifying each role, by identifying the role of each director, by identifying directors' intention, purpose, and this is an activity for your board. Coming together as a board and laying down each individual professional identity of the director, defining each individual's professional identity, allows you to create this framework of faith-based governance. Okay, we're coming to the end of the presentation. To help all of this discussion come to life, I've created a reflective activity that you can complete with your board. And the activity is an individual activity that allows the board then to come together and apply, I'll just go back, these two frameworks. And so the activity involves writing a reflections, using your perspectives from the retreat, from this session, about 500 words initially, on the insights or the learning that you've gained regarding self-evaluation and succession planning for your board. So a description of your awareness, insights, or learning, and I've given you a description of what that involves. A critical explanation or analysis that involves you really critically analyzing your insights and your knowledge and your experience. This is a self-awareness and an inward thinking activity, okay? And also your future perspectives, how your perspectives have changed, how you have transformed in terms of your thinking about governance, what you knew about governance, what you now know of governance. And after writing that 500 words, walking away for a week, a couple of days maybe, contemplating what you've written in this reflection, and then writing what we call a denouement, or a conclusion of thoughts, about how you reflected, why you reflected the way you did, and how you consider that reflection relates to this self-evaluation and succession planning strategies on your board. And you can make reference to the faith-based governance framework. Okay, final reflections, a way forward. What I'd like to do now is I'm just going to stop share and then give an opportunity for you now to have an open discussion about the presentation. Farah, can we facilitate the discussion?
Yes. Anybody has any comments, any questions? First of all, thank you, Dr. Ayda, for a wonderful presentation. I'm hoping everybody benefited and they can take this information back to their campuses, to their boards, and apply the learning. Anybody have any questions, any comments?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Dr. Ayda, Jazakallah khairan, excellent presentation. So I want to present one of the struggles that we have between the inward and outward challenges. It's kind of mixed. You know, one of the outward challenges that we have is the, we want to hire teachers that are, certified in teaching English. And most of the time we end up with teachers who are non-Muslims. English teaching is one of the best opportunities to teach Islamic values to our kids. So, one of the teachers had, with good intention, when I discuss, Islamic topics, and what ended up happening, sometimes the students exploit this opportunity and start challenging the teacher with topics that are beyond the capacity of that or non-Muslim teachers to discuss such topics. So we want our kids to, at the end, to read Islamic references, to discuss, to read and write and use that opportunity. How can we do that? How we balance? I know you talked about the balance between, Islamic studies teachers and non-Islamic studies teachers, but how can we have those non-Islamic studies teachers be on board within a framework that fits our institutions? I don't know with CISNA, if there's resources, if there's any guidance on that. Jazakallah khair.
Welcome, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for that question. In response to that question, this is again a governance issue that exists in many Islamic schools. How do we equip our teachers in order to respond to the intuitions of students? Particularly, and I mentioned this in the presentation, a really important governance issue in Islamic schools is this global youth culture. The students are part of this global youth culture. They are part of the social media generation. And there are big movements at the moment, particularly given the circumstances that are in play at the moment on a global scale. How do we do that? How do we ensure that balance? What I invite you to consider and think about and contemplate is what knowledge does the director of the board have about how we deal with the global youth movement? Are directors equipped to, rather than thinking about how do we hire a teacher, as a director, what do I know about the global youth movement? Again, this is part of the discussion of creating an inward culture. And that inward culture involves us first reflecting on our role and our purpose individually. So what is my role as a director? How much knowledge do I have? And do my colleagues have the same views in terms of what they think about mainstream teachers engaging in interaction or what we call embedding Islamic knowledge into mainstream curriculum? Do we have a school culture that embeds Islamic curriculum, or are we just teaching Islamic studies as an ad hoc to mainstream curriculum? These are decisions that the board needs to take before they think about hiring the right person. In my view, the inward process has to start at a board level first, and defining the culture of the school has to be defined by the culture of the board first. And that'll help the board make that decision about how to recruit an English teacher or a non-Muslim English teacher, whether it's a Muslim or non-Muslim. It depends on the culture that you want to apply on your board first. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. But the thing is, how the culture at the board level, we want to incorporate it. But at the admin level, they got to a point where, okay, we don't want to deal with this. And this is not right? Like we have to, how do we transition? How do we equip our admins to where they don't say, oh, okay, I don't want to have my teacher have to deal with this. What resources do we have? I don't know if CISNA provides resources if we have no other option besides hiring non-Muslim teachers. Like how do we equip this non-Muslim teacher with onboarding and orientation, I guess?
I have observed and researched Islamic schools that have been very successful in embedding their school's ethos to a majority non-Muslim teaching community. Okay. There are, and I'm sure that there are many schools in the United States that are doing the same. This is, again, related to how the board sets their standard in terms of identity, how, I don't want to use the word strict, how confident is the board in ensuring the board's identity becomes part of the school culture. The issue in governance in Islamic schools in particular is this top-down perspective, top-down model. One of the main reasons that there is corruption in corporations, in Western corporations in particular, is because of this separation of ownership from control, where the board is overseeing the operations of the CEO, and the CEO is invested in making sure that he's making or she is making the most money, because at the end of the day, the board get a share of it and the CEO also gets a share of the stake, okay? And so this issue of corruption occurs, not because the board is not making decisions properly, but because it's a top-down model. The same applies in Islamic schools from a different scenario. Islamic schools that apply a top-down approach, where the board sits at the top, and then you have the principal or the CEO, and then you have everyone else, and then you have students, and then you have parents. That model allows gaps to infiltrate and creates a culture that is very toxic. And it allows corruption to eventuate. The faith-based governance model that I've created, and definitely a lot of behavioral scholars would agree with, is a bottom-up approach, where the board sits at the foundation. You can't create a culture for non-Muslims in Islamic schools without sitting at the bottom as the foundation. Your job is to role play. And so this inward thinking becomes vital. This is why I'm trying to substantiate the idea that we think about the idea as an outward problem, but it's actually, the idea is important. The solution to that idea is an inward process.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you.
وإياكم إن شاء الله.
Thank you, Dr. Ayda. Yeah, go ahead, Sylvia.
Yeah, just a little question. You know, we can build this culture, but I do want to find out, you know, what's the way, because in our school, we have board elections, and it's kind of like the parent body nominates, and then, you know, once those nominations come through, we ask those people if they're ready to be on the board, and then there's general election. So if we want to maintain a culture in this democratic election kind of scenario, how it's not always possible. You know, like you said, when you want incoming board members to have all these inward qualities and outward qualities, it's depending on the larger body of parents, what their idea is, what they want, that they come in. So when there are new incoming board members, the whole inward and outward model that you told, it can be shifted completely depending on who's coming in, and somebody who's already on the board might not have control on what the culture becomes.
Thank you, Sophia. The question is really important. So thank you very much for that question. I want to present you with an idea. Boards that, you know, this idea that boards are being selected through an election process, where a parents committee or parents of the community, the school community, are selecting members or nominating members for consideration, is very healthy. It's a very healthy process. And while I have my thoughts about, by the way, this discussion of democracy, I'm motivated and encouraged and inspired by the shura perspective or the Islamic perspective on shura. Definitely in terms of the way our Prophet and the Khulafa elected members of Islamic Council in order to be leaders of the Muslim community or the Muslim Ummah during that time. When we are selecting our board members or when people are nominating particular people to sit on the board, why is it not useful for us to ask these people to consider their Muslim identity? What is their purpose? Why is it not, regardless of, so if we have a school that has a strong ethos, a strong governance foundation, and the school historically, whether it's their founders or the previous board or previous members or founding members or people who are inspired, even the principal, has a solid understanding and foundation of the school's ethos, the school's values, the school's policies around different governance elements of the school, whether it's education, religious instruction, administration, infrastructure, etc. Why is it when we are selecting board members to be nominated, when we're selecting them to join the board, we don't ask them to complete the professional identity framework? What is your, and that can be part of the assessment process and the nomination process. What is your purpose? How will your actions and attitudes benefit the board and the school community? Okay, what are your values, attributes, and beliefs? These are ways that, and regardless of whether you are rotating every 2 years or not, you are constantly engaging in this cycle to make sure that the people who are coming on the board have the right intention and they understand their skills and expertise are going to benefit the school. And the school community can be educated on this professional identity framework so that when the school community are nominating potential directors, they also understand that this person is being selected or nominated because their purpose is, they've clearly stated, such and such. Okay, that's my thoughts around a political process of governance.
Jazakallah khairan.
Oh yeah, Commission.
Does anybody have any further questions or comments? I think you can bring this session to a closure. Thank you again, Dr. Ayda, for the wonderful presentation. We have recorded the session, and inshallah, we will be able to share its recording, inshallah, soon. I thank everybody for taking the time on a Friday evening. I understand everybody's tired from work, so Jazakumullah khairan. The fact that you're here shows your commitment to deep learning and becoming better and better as we go through the process. So again, thank you so much for everybody's time. Inshallah, we'll close this session. Thank you again, Dr. Ayda. We learned a lot from you, and we make du'as for barakah in your ilm and effort. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for making time to meet with us, and may Allah reward all the participants as well for, inshallah, attending this session. Jazakumullah khair katira. Subhanaka. Alhamdulillah. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you, everyone. I hope this session has been beneficial to the group, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for your work.
Ameen. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you, Jazakumullah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Everybody can leave this session, inshallah.